Hello, everybody. It's so wonderful to see all of you and a real honor to be here in Korea. I've just been delighted to see how my work has resonated with Korean audiences. So happy to see so many of you. I know there are parents in the crowd. I see some school children up in the balcony, which just makes me super, super happy. I want to thank the World Knowledge Forum for inviting me and all the folks doing all the hard work to make this happen. So I am going to go ahead and get started. I always like to talk about my disclosures, which is to say I do not receive any money from medical companies, but I have been retained as an expert witness in litigation against opioid pharmaceutical companies and also against social media companies. So I want you to know that. So let's go ahead and get started. Here are our learning objectives. I want to do a very brief overview of the neuroscience of pleasure and pain and what happens in the brain as we go from recreational use to addictive use. And to do that, I'm going to use the extended metaphor of a pleasure-pain balance, which I'll talk about. And then what I want to do is I want to widen the lens to talk about something that I call the plenty paradox, which is essentially the question of why is it that as nations become wealthier, their citizens become less and less happy. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what we can do about it, both as individuals and as societies looking toward the future. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, what is addiction? Broadly defined, addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and or others. Addiction is a brain disease, but as of yet, there are still no blood tests or brain scans to make the diagnosis. We base the diagnosis on what we call phenomenology. So this is patterns of behavior that repeat themselves across individuals, cultures, and time periods. Addiction is a complex biopsychosocial disease. So that means there are biological reasons for addiction, there are psychological reasons for addiction, and there are environmental reasons for addiction. And here's the really good news. Addiction is a treatable disorder. And when people engage in addiction treatment, they can get better. A lot of times we have this idea that people with addiction will never get better, but it's not true. People can get into recovery from addiction at any stage of life. Okay, so let's talk about the neuroscience of pleasure and pain. One of the exciting discoveries in neuroscience is the discovery of a dedicated reward circuit in the brain that consists of the prefrontal cortex, that's that gray matter area right behind our foreheads that acts like the brakes on the car, and then those deep limbic structures that are rich in dopamine-releasing neurons that act like the accelerator on the car. And addiction is a problem either with too little brakes, too much accelerator, or some combination of both. Dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brains. It's a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge the gap between neurons. So neurons are these long, spindly cells in our brains. They're like electrical wires. Our brains are essentially a bundle of wires. But those wires don't touch end to end. There's a little gap between them, and that gap is called the synapse. And neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge that gap between neurons to allow for fine-tuned adjustment of those electrical circuits. Dopamine has been discovered as a neurotransmitter that's very important for pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors. This is taken from a series of experiments where a probe was stuck in a rat's brain to measure dopamine levels. We're always releasing dopamine at a kind of baseline tonic rate in our brains. It's kind of like the heartbeat of the brain. And when we encounter something in our lives that is pleasurable or reinforcing or rewarding, our brains tell us, oh, wow, go check that out, get some more of that. And we release dopamine in the reward pathway. And as you can see here, in mice and rats, chocolate releases dopamine 55% above baseline, sex is 100%, nicotine 150%, cocaine 225, and amphetamine 1,000. And the amount of dopamine that is released, and the faster it is released, the more likely that substance is to be rewarding or reinforcing and potentially addictive. And indeed, if you put a rat in a cage with a lever to press for cocaine or amphetamine, that rat will press that lever till exhaustion or death. Now, keep in mind that human beings and rats aren't exactly the same. In fact, it's really hard to get a rat addicted to alcohol, but it's not very hard to get a human being addicted to alcohol. So there is this concept of drug of choice. What's really reinforcing for one person may not be for another. Now, unfortunately, we don't have little rat smartphones, right? So we don't have a way to measure how much dopamine is released in rats. And in humans, it's actually hard to measure absolute levels of dopamine, right? We still don't have the tools to do that very well. But there was a person in France who actually rigged a machine so that little mice could take selfies. And first he paired that with sugar water because mice will press a lever for sugar water. So every time they pressed the lever for sugar water, they got a selfie. But then he took the sugar water away, and guess what? The rats still pressed the lever to see pictures of themselves. So it could be that mice are just as addicted to selfies as we are. And what we know is that when we see digital media and when we see our phones, it lights up the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. Digital media are a drug. Remember that. Digital media are a drug. It also turns out that dopamine is very important for movement, right? So it's probably no coincidence that the same neurotransmitter that's important for movement is also important for pleasure, reward, and motivation, because most of the time the organism needs to move to get its reward. But now we live in a time and place where we don't have to work hard at all. We can just sit on the couch, swipe right, swipe left, and have our reward delivered immediately to our brains, which is very, very confusing for our brains, because our brains evolved over millions of years of evolution to have to work very hard to get a little bit of reward. And now we don't have to do any work at all to get a whole lot of reward. And that is causing problems for our brains. And I'm going to tell you what kind of problems that's causing. So let's talk about what happens in the brain as we become addicted. One of the most exciting findings in neuroscience in the past 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. The same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So imagine that deep in your nucleus accumbens, there's something like this, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. When we do something pleasurable that releases dopamine, it tips one way. When we do something that's painful, it tips the other. Now, there are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level with the ground. This is what neuroscientists call homeostasis, such that with any deviation from neutrality, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance. And how our brains do that is key to understanding what happens when we get addicted. Our brain responds to pleasure or dopamine by downregulating dopamine transmission. And I like to imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. This is the come down, the hangover, or just that moment of craving, right? Wanting to watch one more TikTok video or have one more glass of wine or smoke one more cigarette. Now, if we wait long enough and we don't use our drug of choice, the gremlins get the message that their job is done, they hop off the pain side of the balance, and homeostasis is restored. But if we continue to consume our drug of choice over days and weeks and months and years, we change the brain, right? Those gremlins start to multiply. They get bigger and stronger, and eventually they are camped out on the pain side of the balance. And now we've entered into addicted brain. What does that mean? That means we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to get high and feel good, but just to level the balance and stop feeling bad. And the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance or behavior are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. In my clinical psychiatric practice, I have lots of patients who come in and they want help with depression. They want help with anxiety. But all day long, they're on their phones or they're drinking alcohol or they're vaping nicotine. And they don't realize that it's their addictive behavior that's leading to the depression and the anxiety. And that the best intervention is actually to stop using their drug of choice for long enough so that the gremlins can hop off the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis can be restored. Just to represent this in very simple graphical terms, when we initially expose our brain to something that's pleasurable, we get a spike in dopamine, followed by dopamine free fall before going back to baseline. If we continue to use our drug of choice over days to weeks to months to years, that upward deflection of dopamine gets shorter and weaker, but that after response gets stronger and longer, and we can end up in what's called a chronic dopamine deficit state. And that can look exactly like depression, exactly like anxiety, insomnia, inattention. This is from a very famous experiment in human beings, looking at the amount of dopamine in the reward pathway. And here, dopamine is represented by red. And what you can see is that in the left-hand column, those are healthy individuals, and they have plenty of red, so plenty of dopamine in the reward pathway. In the right-hand column, we have people who have been addicted to drugs and alcohol, and they have almost no red, so very low dopamine levels. And importantly, the people who were addicted to substances, they had not been using their drug of choice for 2 weeks, right? So even after stopping our drug of choice, it can take a while for our dopamine levels to come back up again. And this is why it's so difficult to stop, right? Because right when we stop, we don't feel better, we feel worse, right? We take the pleasure off the pleasure side of the balance, and all those gremlins slam us down to the side of pain. But if we can just get through the first 10 to 14 days, eventually those gremlins will get the message, they'll hop off, homeostasis will be restored, and we will begin to get our brains back. Now, the other really important rule about the balance is that the balance can be triggered not just by our drug of choice, but also by reminders of our drug of choice. People, places, and things that trigger craving and make us want to use. This image is taken from an experiment, again, in mice with a probe in their brain to measure dopamine levels. And this mouse has learned that if it sees the light and it goes and presses the button, it will get cocaine. So let's see what happens to dopamine. You can see on the right-hand side of the graph, when the mouse gets cocaine, dopamine levels go way up. But look what happens when the mouse sees the light. Just knowing our reward is coming releases a little bit of dopamine, which then makes us crave our drug of choice. The reason this is so important is because when we want to get into recovery from compulsive overconsumption, we have to avoid our drug, but we also have to avoid triggers for our drug, right? So if we're addicted to our smartphones and we want to stop using our smartphones, what we need to do is turn off notifications, right? Or even power our phones down and off and put them in our bags. Because as long as that thing is vibrating or dinging in our pocket, it's going to trigger dopamine and make us want to look. How about if we've learned to expect a certain reward and then that reward doesn't come? Well, guess what? Then dopamine levels go below normal, right? Then we're in an acute dopamine deficit state, and now we want to do all this work to bring it back up again. When you think about social media and how unpredictable it is, almost like using a slot machine in a casino, you can see why kids who post online or get likes or see what their friends are doing, if they don't get the response they want, or they text somebody and they don't hear back, they don't just walk away and say, oh well. They say, hey, wait a minute, how can I spend more time on this to bring my dopamine levels back up again? The point being that the intervention is to put the device away and wait until the brain realizes, okay, I'm not going to get my dopamine stimulation from that thing. I can now start to upregulate and make my own dopamine again. All right, so that's a very brief and simplified overview of the neuroscience. But let's talk about what's happening at a societal level. Let's widen the lens. So the plenty paradox. For hundreds of years, what we saw in the world was that as countries got richer, people got happier. But about 30 to 50 years ago, that started to change. And all of a sudden, the richest countries in the world were showing the least happy people and the highest rates of depression and anxiety. This is, again, just a way to say, as countries now have gotten richer, people have gotten less and less happy. And this is certainly related to many different factors, but one of them absolutely is the technology. The technology is amazing. There are so many good things about it, but there's also this very, very dark side, and we need to talk about it. Also, for the first time in human recorded history, people in wealthy nations are more likely to kill themselves than people in poorer nations. This is a paradox. Why is it now, when we have everything we could ever want and more, are we so desperately unhappy? And of course, this applies to the wonderful country of South Korea as well. We know that rates of depression and anxiety are steadily going up in South Korea, just as they are in the United States and other wealthy nations. We know that rates of suicide are going up in South Korea, just as they are in the United States and other wealthy nations. What on earth is happening? I suggest to you that part of the explanation for growing anxiety and depression in wealthy nations is because we have drugified our environment. We have taken almost every substance and almost every behavior, including behaviors that we usually think of as good for us, and we have turned it into a drug. We have made it more accessible, right? You don't have to work very hard now for rewards. And access is a huge risk factor for addiction. The US opioid epidemic is a perfect example of this. In the United States, when doctors started to write more prescriptions for opioids for their patients, more patients got addicted, more patients died. We live in a world now where we have free and infinite access to digital media. And remember, I told you, digital media is a drug. It stimulates the reward pathway. It's highly reinforcing. It releases dopamine, right? And now, of course, we are seeing digital media addiction. We've made everything more potent. What does that mean? That means we've engineered it through the application of technology to be more rewarding, more reinforcing, right? We've taken everything and we've made it more fun, more interesting, more exciting, right? Releasing more dopamine. Quantity and frequency really matter. If we used our intoxicants only rarely and infrequently, it would probably be okay. The problem is now our entire day is arranged around our rewards, right? From the moment we wake up and reach for our phones and drink our caffeinated beverages and go to work and watch YouTube videos and watch some more on our break and come home and eat donuts and watch Netflix, we're constantly bombarding our reward pathway. And then, of course, novelty. Our brains get tired of the same old reward, and we develop tolerance. So we need more and more to get the same effect. That's the gremlins on the pain side of the balance. So we need newness, always newness. And how do we do that? We combine new drugs together to overcome tolerance. So what can we do about it? This is both an individual problem and a societal problem. Just like global warming or pollution is an individual problem and a societal problem. We have, through human engineering, changed the world that we live in so that the world that we have created is now a mismatch for our ancient wiring. This pleasure-pain balance is pure genius for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger where we would have to work very, very hard to get a tiny little bit of reward. But it's a terrible biological mechanism for a world of overwhelming overabundance, which is the world that we live in now. So what can we do? We have to create a world within a world. Right? We have to abstain from our drug of choice for long enough for the gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. We must engage in self-binding strategies so that we can put a barrier between ourselves and our drug of choice. And, wait for it, we have to intentionally seek out pain or do things that are hard, because that's what our brain evolved for. Our brain evolved for a world of striving and hardship, not the world of pleasure and frictionless abundance that we live in now. Okay, so what I often invite my patients to do, the ones who come in with depression and anxiety, right, who are addicted to drugs or alcohol or sex or shopping or cannabis or social media or whatever it is, I invite them to abstain from their drug of choice for 4 weeks. Why 4 weeks? Because 4 weeks is the amount of time that patients are willing to imagine, right? If I ask people, I want you to stop forever, never do that again, they'll go out my door and I won't get any traction. But if I say, hey, can you do an experiment? Stop using your drug of choice for 4 weeks. And I bet that at the end of those 4 weeks, you're going to be less depressed. You're going to be less anxious. You're going to be able to take more joy in modest rewards, right? It's just an experiment. I mean, I may be wrong, but let's give it a try. And then the most important thing I can tell my patients is, but I have to warn you, this is really, really hard. You will feel worse before you feel better. Why? Because those gremlins that have been accumulating on the pain side of your balance are going to smash you down to the side of pain. But if you can just get through those first 10 to 14 days, I really think you're going to feel a whole heck of a lot better. This is a very famous study that was done by my colleague, Mark Schuckett, showing that if you take a group of adult men who are addicted to alcohol and who also are very depressed, and you put them in a hospital where they have no access to alcohol, but you don't give them any treatment for depression, no antidepressants, no psychotherapy, nothing. You just say no alcohol for 1 month. At the end of that 1 month, 80% of those individuals will no longer be depressed. So just by stopping their addictive drug for long enough, they feel better. And this is really, really important because patients will say to me, but Dr. Lemke, alcohol is the only thing that works for my depression, right? Smoking is the only thing that helps my anxiety. Watching TikTok is the only thing that relaxes me. And I say to them, I know that in the moment it makes you feel better, but all you're really doing is temporarily getting out of that dopamine deficit state while you're adding more gremlins to the pain side of the balance. Patients then ask me, but Dr. Lemke, what if I'm addicted to sex or addicted to food or addicted to my digital device? I can't get off my device. I need to be on it for work, for kids, to communicate with my family. Then we use this bullseye, which we've adapted from Gamblers Anonymous for people who get addicted to gambling. And what you do is you don't eliminate food altogether, but you might eliminate sugar or ultra-processed food, and you would abstain from that for 1 month, right? Or if it's digital media, you don't get rid of your phone altogether, but you might delete all of your social media for a month, right? Or you might say no online shopping for a month, right? Or no TikTok for a month. And then in the middle circle, this is where you would also keep in mind people, places, and things, the things that can trigger us. So for someone addicted to gambling, they would have to delete all of their gambling apps, right? And then also maybe not watch anybody else gambling, right? Not watch YouTube videos of people gambling, not go by the gambling casino, create some distance. And then in that outer circle is the things that are healthy sources of dopamine. Things like getting together with family in real life, getting together with friends, walking in nature. I talk a lot about self-binding. So self-binding is literal and metacognitive barriers that we put between ourselves and our drug of choice so that we can press the pause button between desire and consumption. If we wait until we have plenty of our drug in front of us to decide to say, no, I'm not going to do that, we will not be successful. Willpower only lasts so long. In the morning, we wake up with more willpower than we have at the end of the day. So when we wake up in the morning, we have to plan for the end of the day and make sure we have barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice. So there are space or geographic barriers. This is things like getting the apps off of our phone or even leaving the phone at home, right? Or getting the phone out of the bedroom or getting the phone out of the meal times, right? Getting potato chips out of the house, getting alcohol out of the house, getting the vape pens out of the house. Get it away from us so that if we get craving or desire, we would have to work harder to get it. This is really important. We can also use time as a self-binding strategy. So typically after people have finished their dopamine fast, they're feeling better, they say, you know, doctor, I'm feeling better. I want to go back to using my drug of choice. Now, that might not be what I recommend, but they have to learn for themselves. So then we make a plan, a very specific plan. What is that going to look like? Okay, when are you going to use, how much, how often? For my patient with a video game addiction who failed out of college because he was spending all day and all night playing video games and became suicidal, he came home, we took away the smartphone, we took away all the screens, right? And for 3 months, he did not look at a screen. And after 3 months, he felt so much better, less depressed, less anxious, no longer thinking about ending his own life. Really much, much better. And then I said to him, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to go back to playing video games, or do you want to continue to abstain? He said, I'd really like to go back to playing video games, but I'd like to play differently. I'd like to play less often and have a different relationship with video games. I said, okay, let's make a plan. What is that going to look like? So he got 2 laptops, one for school and one for video games, right? He said, I'm only going to play video games on Fridays and Saturdays. I'm never going to play League of Legends, because as soon as I play League of Legends, I can't stop. And he said, I'm only going to play with friends, never with strangers. That's a good one, right? Because that way, when I'm playing, I'm augmenting my in real life friendships. I'm not just engaging with the addictive medium with strangers that I don't know. So when we think about setting boundaries with our devices, a really good one is to think about, am I using my device as a drug, or am I using it as a tool? If I'm using it as a tool, that is a good thing. If I'm using it as a drug, that is not a good thing. And how do I know if I'm using it as a drug? Well, if I'm using it to entertain myself, or most importantly, to change the way I feel, then I'm using it as a drug, right? How many of you had had the experience of using your device because you're feeling sad or lonely or bored, and then you go on your device to lift yourself up again? Anybody else? Anybody out there had done that? Any hands raised? Nobody's admitting. A few people, a few brave people. Oh, there's a kid back there raising his hand. Good for you. That's very brave of you to raise your hand. For me personally, I actually got addicted to romance novels on my device, right? I started out just by reading the Twilight Saga. Anybody know Twilight, about the vampires? Anybody read that, liked that, right? We got a couple people. So I read it and I thought, oh, that was fantastic. I wonder if there are any more vampire romance novels. I actually asked that question, if you can believe it. And I went online and I was like, oh, there's a whole universe of vampire romance novels, right? So I started reading more and more and more, and my kids wanted to do things with me. I said, no, I'm busy. I'm reading vampire romance novels, right? And I started staying up later and later in the night, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, reading vampire romance novels. My husband said, hey, wife, pay attention to me. I said, no, get out of here. I'm reading vampire romance novels. And then the next day I would go to work and see my patients falling asleep because I was up all night reading vampire romance novels. And then pretty soon, vampire romance novels were not potent enough for my brain. So then I had to get to racier and racier, more graphic, more explicit types of scenes. And pretty soon I found myself up at 3 in the morning reading 50 Shades of Grey, which is a strong departure from teenage vampire romance novels, right? I see some knowing nods out there. Thank you for people who can relate to what I'm talking about. And I'm an addiction doctor, right? And I got addicted to vampire romance novels and didn't even realize what was happening. Did not realize it. And then one day, I'm teaching my psychiatry residents, and we're doing like a role play. And I had to be one of the patients because there weren't enough students to make even pairs. So I'm talking to my resident, and he's playing the doctor, and I'm playing the patient, and he says, is there any behavior that you'd like to change? And I just said, yeah, I'd like to give up my late night reading. He said, that's interesting. Why do you want to stop? I said, well, I'm not getting enough sleep, and it's interfering with my goals, and also importantly with my values. Now, I did not tell this young man what I was addicted to. That would have been way too embarrassing. I just said I'm addicted to late night reading. He said, is there one thing that you can do that might help you change that behavior? Just one thing. I said, I could probably give up my e-reader or my Kindle, because the Kindle is what was making it so easy to access those late night vampire romance novels, right? So the next day, as I was walking along, I kept thinking about that conversation. And that night, I read more romance novels, but now I was watching myself reading those novels. The point being that once we put into words and tell another human being exactly what we've been doing, right? We become aware in a way that we're really not, as long as it's hiding in the recesses of our brains. So language is a really important tool. If we use language and tell people, I do this behavior and I want to change it, that's really important news. And it's not just news for the other person, it's news for us, right? It's like, I really do want to change that behavior, and I really need to change that behavior. So that's where we talk about meaning, right? And using radical honesty to let people know what we're doing so that we can become aware and live in accordance with our values. People are really important for self-binding, right? Because we co-regulate with other people. People more and more engaging in secret, private behaviors in isolation from other people because we can, right? Because it's anonymous and we can. So we're getting more and more isolated in our consumptive behaviors. But we can turn away from our drug and turn toward other people and have other people help us co-regulate our behaviors. And it's a very powerful way to change. And this is where groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, Online Shoppers Anonymous, Digital Media Anonymous, we can come together and help each other change those behaviors. And it's very powerful. And science has shown that it's very effective for those who actively participate in those groups. And then, of course, we have medications. These are non-addictive medications that can help people change their appetite, right? So we have something called naltrexone, which blocks the opioid receptor, which helps people not just stop opioid addiction, but also with alcohol addiction. Why would an opioid blocker help with alcohol addiction? Well, because alcohol works through our own endogenous opioid system, right? Naltrexone also helps with gambling addiction because the gambling activity works in part through our own endogenous opioid system. We have other medications like Ozempic and GLP-1 agonists, a very exciting new frontier helping with food addiction, but also showing benefit for opioid addiction, for alcohol addiction, for nicotine addiction, and being actively studied for other types of addictions. Finally, if we think about this pleasure-pain balance, right, we have learned that when we press on the pleasure side, those gremlins go on the pain side, right, and we feel bad afterwards. We feel good in the moment, but bad afterwards. But guess what? If we intentionally press on the pain side, those gremlins will go over on the pleasure side, and we will get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. For example, exercise. Everybody knows that exercise is good for us, but it turns out exercise is actually immediately toxic for cells. So why does it make us feel better? What happens is that the body senses injury to the cells and in response upregulates our feel-good neurotransmitters as a self-regulating healing mechanism. We get more dopamine, more endogenous opioids, more endogenous cannabinoids, serotonin in response to exercise, and that's the runner's high. We also know that ice-cold water immersion helps us feel better afterwards because the body senses injury and upregulates dopamine. It turns out that acupuncture, an ancient Eastern Asian healing method, probably works by causing minor injury at the site of the needle, which then causes the body to release endogenous opioids so we feel better. How about intermittent fasting? Yes, we can get our dopamine from intermittent fasting, right? We have to be careful. We would not recommend that in somebody struggling with an eating disorder. But for those of us who are not struggling with that, practicing intermittent fasting can help us feel better, as well as anything that requires sustained effort, meditation, prayer, etc. Hormesis is a Greek term. It means to set in motion. When we do things that are toxic or noxious for ourselves, our bodies sense injury and upregulate our feel-good neurotransmitters, and we feel good for a sustained period. So for example, this is a dopamine levels when someone begins exercise. Instead of getting that spike in dopamine followed by dopamine free fall, what we see is a gradual increase in dopamine levels, and then they remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back down to the baseline position. We never go into that dopamine deficit state that drives reuse. So we're much less likely to get addicted to pain than we are to pleasure. Many of my addicted patients will say to me, well, I want to stop using alcohol, or I want to stop smoking, or I want to stop going online on pornography, but I need to keep working. I can't change anything in my life. And I say to them, that is not going to work, because recovery from a severe addiction is a full-time job. You need to take a break from work, or you need to slow your work down and actually take time to figure out who you are and recover. When I talk to patients now about doing hard things, this is a list of some of those. And what you'll see here is many of these are ordinary domestic activities that we just do unplugged, right? Not watching anything, not listening to anything. I had a Stanford student from Korea. She came in, she was anxious and depressed. She said, what can I do? I said, well, it sounds like you're plugged into your device all day long. I want you to unplug for a while and see what happens. She did it. She came back to me. I said, how was it? She said, you know, at first it was awful. It was so boring. It was so boring. My mind didn't know what to do. But then after a while, I calmed down. And you know what, Dr. Lemke? I started noticing the trees. I started noticing the trees, right? I started looking around and re-engaging with the world. So when we think today about doing things that are hard, just letting our phones stay at home and going out without them, that's hard for us. Really, really hard, because we're constantly stimulating our brains. But we have to do these things. We really have to. Because otherwise, we're all going to get addicted to digital media. We're going to be by ourselves. And we're not even going to be talking to each other through digital media. We're going to be talking to AI, right? We're going to let AI take over our brains. The real danger of AI is not that AI will take over. It's that we will let it. We will let it. We will titillate ourselves to death. I've come to the end. I hope what you've learned from me today is that what goes up must come down. This is the way that our brains evolved to reflexively seek pleasure and avoid pain. We cannot prevent that innate reflex. But what we can do is invent societal self-binding strategies to protect ourselves so that we will not relentlessly pursue pleasure, because if we do that, we will go into that dopamine deficit state and we will get more depressed and more anxious, and we will lose more young people, which is a great, great tragedy. So what to do about it? Abstain, maintain, and seek out pain, but not too much pain, right? I'm not talking about self-cutting. Cutting does work by that same mechanism, right? But in the long run, cutting is very bad because we injure ourselves, but also it just stops working, right? We need to cut more and cut deeper. It's not a solution. We have to have the right amount of pain, not too much, not too little, and the kind of pain that has us seeking out each other and being together in the right place at the right time. So I'm going to leave you with a challenge, right? I want you to do a little mini experiment, the 24-hour phone-free challenge. I can see this guy up in front here. He's already nervous. But you guys can do it. Maybe do it together as a family, right? Where you go on a digital fast for 24 hours. No screens, no phones, right? We sometimes call this a digital Sabbath. You take a break. The point of this is to just show us how addictive we have become, right? 24 hours is not really enough to reset reward pathways, but it's enough to say, hey, We need to change our relationship with digital media. You can optimize your chances of being successful by setting a date and a time, telling people that you'll be out of reach, because our brains will tell us, oh, no, I have to check because so-and-so is going to need me, or my son might be in trouble, or my boss might be calling. So make sure you let everybody know, hey, I'm not going to be reachable for 24 hours. Really, people, 24 hours, it's not that long, right? Can we do it? Can we do 24 hours? I think we can, right? But it'll feel long. It'll feel long, because when we're in withdrawal, time slows down, right? It slows way down. And then we experience boredom. And when we're bored, we're anxious. It's like, oh no, what am I doing now? Why am I alive? What's the purpose of my life? But those are good questions to ask. It's good to slow down and ask those questions. We can anticipate that we will experience withdrawal, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, craving, but that it's time limited. And the longer we go, the better we'll feel. And when we get intense cravings to use our drug of choice, we can use hormesis, right? Do things that are more painful than the pain of withdrawal, right? Do 50 push-ups, right? Go for a run. Vacuum your house. Clean out your closet. Write a thank you note to grandma. Those hard things, right? That make us feel better afterwards. And then when our 24-hour fast is over, we can think about how we're going to reintegrate our digital device back into our lives, right? Like, really, let's turn off notifications. We don't need that. Let's go grayscale so it's not so potent. Hey, let's power it all the way down so it's not even vibrating in my pocket. And so I'm not mentally thinking about it. I'm looking at all of you, right? And I'm trying to be more present in the moment. And we're doing that together, which feels really good. Thank you so much for your wonderful attention. It's been my absolute joy to talk to all of you. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you, thank you.